Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business Web Seminar entitled How to Drive Student Success Through Personalization and Collaboration, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Genzabar. Before we get started, I would just like to share just a few housekeeping items with you. For technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find on the right side of your screen. Then select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and then type your message if you're having any technical issues. If you don't have computer speakers or if you prefer to listen privately, please dial the phone number and access code that I will be posting in the chat window in a few moments once the presentation begins. Today we will also be welcoming any questions you may have with a Q&A session that will begin at the end of the presentation. To submit a question for our speakers to answer, please use the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom right side of your screen, and send all of your questions to all panelists, which is the default option. If you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels, look again to the right side of your screen and click on the expand triangle, which is directly in front of the panel name to make sure you have access to it. Also, something important to note, if you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, everyone who registered and who is attending today will receive an email with a link to the slide as well as an archive recording. Lastly, one last thing I'd like to mention really quick. I would like to note that we have opened the chat so that you, the members of our audience, can communicate with each other during the presentation. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you all our speakers today. First, we have Melanie Common, who is the Student Product Manager at Genzabar. We also have Dr. Melissa McDowell, who is the Registrar and an Assistant Professor at the University of Mary, as well as Megan Turjanica, who is the Product Manager of Analytics and Student Success at Genzabar. Welcome to have you with us today. Thanks for being with us, you guys. You may begin, and here we go.
All right. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, University of Business, for having us. Thank you, everyone on the call, for taking time to join us today. We look forward to speaking with you and sharing with you information on how to drive student success through personalization and collaboration. All right, as we all know, student success is a priority for higher education institutions, or at least it should be, and here are a few reasons why. Schools are seeing a decline in enrollment, which in turn affects revenues. Government funds are tied to student success outcomes. There's a concern over increasing student debt, and the perception of higher education is changing. We have the students as well as their parents now questioning how valuable that degree is, wondering if the students will actually get a positive return on their investment. To institutional leaders, the common definition of student success has to do with improved access, better engagement, and of course, better retention or graduation rates. Traditionally, student success centers around academic completion, but the definitions of student success could differ based on who you ask. Schools need to understand at an institutional level, not just the individual level, who their students are so they can be supported appropriately. Because every student defines success differently, advisors need to engage in conversations that are just beyond building that schedule to get them to graduate on time. We all remember going in our freshman year and getting that check sheet and going once a semester to check off and pick those classes we need. We need schools and institutions to start personalizing that student experience, leveraging data and analytics, and collaborate as a community to ensure student progress and follow through. Oftentimes, we see schools confusing student success with institutional success. Take, for example, it is very important for schools to understand retention rates and what drives it. Yes, we all know that's important to know, but we also need to consider success for some students may not include persisting from one term to the next for that four-year degree. There might be some students that are saving all the money they can for that one semester to take the courses that they need and not get into debt. And then maybe they have to work a little bit more, and then they can come back another term in the future. We also need to think about CBE type programs, competency-based education type programs, where a student, for success for them, might be taking one course to gain a skill that's going to help advance them in their career. And that's success for them. They don't need that four-year degree. They just need a course or two to gain the skills they need to succeed. So schools need to understand what is driving each and every one of their students to the success. As we all know, student success is not a one-size-fits-all, and there's not a one single bullet approach. The overarching outcome is to have the student feel empowered in his or her experience. Personalization is key here, and there's a few strategies to consider. Intrusive advising, also called collaborative advising, it goes beyond the traditional task of the advisor sitting and picking out the courses with the student. This approach allows the advisor to look at the student's individual needs and goals. It provides the ability to help the student to flex as those goals change and work with them one-on-one. Also, communication is a two-way street. There should be a feedback loop where information is always available to the student and it's on demand and up to date for them. Another strategy to consider is guided pathways. The student comes in, you help give them the starting point based on where they want to go and what they want to accomplish. This prepares the student for what to expect with their time on campus and thereafter. They can see what courses to take when those courses are going to be available. They can actually see that path to graduation, and they have an understanding of salary expectations, job placement, and market demand well before they even get there. Benefits of this include not wasting the student's time and money on classes that might not be needed. It keeps them hyper-focused and gives them a bigger sense of purpose. And the last strategy to discuss is providing alternative paths. Before we talked about courses and advising, and we also mentioned as an optional or a type of path for the students, CBE or that competency-based education. This is where the student can gain a skill or a competency. It's good for those that want to master a skill to work towards something in at their job. Along with this, faculty can spend more time on specific students and their challenges, which helps foster closer relationships. This type of learning is self-paced, which means progression is self-motivated and internally driven, resulting in higher student engagement. Also, when properly established, institutions have the mechanisms to support students if they are struggling with new concepts, which leads to a more continuous and seamless learning journey. This is often appealing to the non-traditional student population. I'm now going to hand it off to Melissa to speak to us about how she approached personalization at the University of Mary. Melissa, you can go ahead and take it away.
Great, thanks, Melanie. To get started, just a little bit about my own institution, the University of Mary. We are located in Bismarck, North Dakota, with extension sites in North Dakota, Montana, Kansas, Arizona, and also in Rome, Italy. We're a Christian Catholic and Benedictine institution founded in 1959. We recently went from master's awarding to doctoral professional awarding Carnegie class. We got a whole bunch of programs, and we tend to hover around 3,800 students. And a good thing to know about us is we do have a pretty healthy mix of traditional undergraduate programs as well as adult and distance ed programs. So as an industry, we tend to skew heavily toward thinking about everything from institutional metrics to program design in terms of the traditional undergraduate student, which is that 18 to 24-year-old who enrolled in a traditional face-to-face program right out of high school. However, we know that the traditional student represents an ever-shrinking proportion of total college students in the U.S. At my own institution, only 50% of our total population is made up of traditional undergraduate students. This means that half of our tuition revenue base is made up of students who don't fit into the traditional college student mold, whether that be because they are graduate students in one of our traditional daytime grad programs, non-traditional adult students completing their bachelor's degree in one of our accelerated programs, adults enrolled in one of our accelerated or online grad programs, or perhaps even a non-degree seeker pursuing totally different goals. It is essential that we do not make the mistake of ignoring these unique student groups in favor of focusing on the traditional student only. And our strategies for both recruiting these divergent groups and later retaining and supporting them differ quite widely. But all strategies are targeted at the specific students and where they are in their life, career, and goals. The traditional undergrad, for example, is generally looking for a very particular experience from their college years, and they will pursue the desired experience at exclusion to all else, often even including the cost or the availability of their preferred major. And an adult student, on the other hand, more often thinks of college or university as a transaction, exchanging the minimal amount of money and time to receive their degree. If you try to engage an adult by telling them all about your super well thought out residence life program, they will be deeply disinterested. This doesn't mean that adults don't want to feel like a part of the university social group at all, but rather that things which socially and academically integrate adults into the university community are often very different from the ones that work for your traditional students. I think that most people who work in recruitment understand this basic principle, but too often this train of thought stops at the point of matriculation and really doesn't carry forth into how we design or think about our programs or support services. There's often a mistaken belief of, oh, adult students don't care about this stuff, or they don't need this or that, they're adults. In reality, though, adults often need just as much or more support from the traditional students, and it absolutely has to be tailored to them in terms of access, timing, and content. At UMary, we seek to personalize the advising experience that each student receives based on both their student type and also on their individual goals. We implement a number of advising strategies using both faculty advisors and professional advisors. We segment our incoming freshmen each year, for example, by academic preparedness level. Students with lower incoming GPAs and scores are assigned to a professional advisor out of our Student Success Center during their first term, and their first year experience course is also taught by that advisor. Intrusive advising and basic how to college skill building is baked into that FYE course. And this group meets individually with their advisor a minimum of 3 times during that first semester. The FYE course also includes assistance in picking a major that aligns with their goals and mapping out a potential career plan using career guidance software. Additionally, the student and their advisor use our academic planning software to put together a complete 4-year plan that is individualized to the student. After their first semester, these students and their advising plans are handed off to regular faculty advisors, after which point they are on the same general advising path as their other traditional undergrads, which leads me to our freshmen who come in with high GPAs and scores who are treated just a little bit differently during that first term. They are still registered in the same FYE course, but they are assigned immediately to faculty advisors rather than to the student success team during that first semester. And that's done on the basis that they are likely better prepared for the new academic challenge. The FYE course still incorporates some intrusive advising tactics, but these students are not required to do the 3 mandatory advising meetings during their first term. And kind of similar, our new transfer students are also assigned directly to faculty advisors, and they too have a new student seminar course, but their seminar is pared down to be more suitable for students who have previous college experience. And next is our adult student population who are enrolled in one of our accelerated degree programs, either online or at one of our evening locations. This group is inclusive of both bachelor's degree completers and grad students. For these students, their program, delivery modality, and supports are all tailored to suit adult students, people with families, full-time jobs, and competing commitments. We have a specialized advising team that works exclusively with this student population. Each student is assigned a success advisor rather than a faculty advisor, although some of our grad programs do also assign a faculty person. One major difference when working with adults is that term-over-term persistence is not a good measure of their success, as this group is constantly subject to competing priorities from both family and career. And because these students tend to get these little life interruptions fairly often, the Student Success Advisor practices intrusive advising for these students and operates almost like a concierge with constant touch points, reminders, and check-ins to ensure that the student never really gets a chance to fall behind in their accelerated courses, or at least not without a fair amount of effort on the part of that student. Their success advisors also carefully track these students when they have stopped out for a term and proactively reach back out to re-engage them at the point in time that the student indicated they expected to return, so that a 1 semester break doesn't escalate into 2, 3, and a couple of years, and then they never come back. So in each of these examples, we've adapted our out-of-the-gate programming and advising tactics to suit the skill, experience level, and life stage of each group of students, ensuring that each group has the right kinds of supports and their expectations and our expectations are in alignment with each other. And while all of this sounds great, and in reality, we really do a pretty good job. But while we put all of this effort into the individual focus on these different student types, we definitely do have some blind spots as well. For example, while we offer remedial and preparatory courses in both English composition and math, none of those courses have been adapted for online delivery, making them totally inaccessible to our adult undergrads, even though that population often really does need remedial support. Additionally, we often suffer from a shortage of tutoring services for our distance students, as we purchase a limited number of hours through our online tutoring service each semester. And a lot of those hours get eaten up by our traditional students who prefer to use that service instead of in-person tutoring on campus. So these are just a couple of things that I would like to see us address in the near future as we seek to ever improve our student support services. And I'm now going to hand it over to Megan, who will talk us through leveraging data effectively.
Hi. One of the things that I think is really interesting about everything we've heard Melissa talk about is the depth of knowledge and information they've gained about their particular student. To get that depth of knowledge, to really understand your students, you do need to have a lot of data on them. And the good news is all of you do have a ton of data on your students, or most of you. There are some exceptions to that rule, of course. Understanding that data is really key to being able to increase student success. So at Genzabar, we started, a decade ago, looking at predictive modeling and looking at, from, as we've talked already, that institutional perspective of student success, which is retention rates, which, as we have covered, is not the only, or maybe in a sense, not the most important metric when it comes to student success, but it is relatively easily measurable. And so that's where we started. And we went from there and we looked at that institutional rate and we said, okay, how can we mobilize campus resources to move that needle? And the hope is that rates would improve. And it turns out when you do segment your population and understand them and understand their chances of risk, and then take active steps from there, it does actually make a difference. And you do see that retention rates will improve over time. The answer to really understanding your students, as I said already, is that data. There is so much data available, sometimes over 70 sources on campus. It is also, though, almost all that data makes it just overwhelming. So it's important to know what's useful and know how to act on it. And here are some things that we have found that are really, really valuable. So we've talked about predictive modeling, sort of, that's what I was leading into with retention. So when you consider you have all this data on incoming students, for like a traditional student, you know their high school GPA, and you know the scores if they've taken tests. You know a lot of information about them. But there's more than that too. There's also the softer side, the non-cognitive elements of student success. If you compare things like understanding educational commitment or student behavior, as well as these more hard, easy to measure factors, you get a really, really strong prediction that will help you understand which of your students are actually at risk, because that is one of the big mysteries. Unless you know who's at risk, you don't know who to target with intervention plans. So using a retention score from like a predictive model to target your interventions, one great way of doing this is a bit what Melissa described what they do with their more at-risk students, which is you take those students who are going to need a little extra help, the model says they're probably at risk, and you assign them to particular advisors who have a skill set of working with students who are going to need more hands-on help. Another thing that's really important and something that we've seen be quite successful is removal of functional barriers. And this is an interesting way of using data. It's a surprising one. So think about a chatbot. We recently released a chatbot, and what we've discovered is it's been eye-opening for the institutions who have gone live on the chatbot and who have seen things that they didn't even know were functional barriers to success. What we often forget in higher education is that there is quite a challenge in identifying what is actually difficult for students to navigate. We're so steeped in this thing we've been doing for a long time, we often don't even know what questions they're going to ask. We have FAQs that we update, but we've been using the same FAQs for quite some time. And so, how do you actually get at what's causing them problems? And how do you help students be self-starters and navigate that process? Well, a chatbot or something like that definitely helps with this. First of all, it removes the functional barrier by providing 24/7 to student questions, even ones that the student might be afraid to ask the human, such as, what is financial aid? That sounds like maybe they should know the answer to that, but what if they don't, and where do they start? And they don't want to be silly or look silly. They can start with a chatbot because the chatbot's not going to judge them. So it provides that access to answers. Also think about that, people who are in traditional 8-to-5 jobs, they're not going to be able to take a break necessarily and call the registrar's office to ask their question about deadlines. So how do they get an answer at 7 o'clock at night if your office isn't open? Well, again, a chatbot could help with that. But what's really interesting is what happens on the flip side. One institution in particular found something absolutely fascinating in their data that they have gotten from implementing a chatbot, and that was that, for example, their bill pay process was incredibly hard to navigate. So they kept seeing these questions roll in after they've implemented about how can I pay my bill? And so they decided to take a closer look at what they'd done. Turns out it was a 5-6-step process, and the crowning achievement of that process is when students got to the page where there actually was the link to pay their bill, that link did not say, pay your bill. It said something else entirely different. So even when the student was able to navigate through the 5 steps before clicking the link, they got to the link and they sat there. And this is what the chatbot quickly revealed, these sort of broken processes on these and then the other campuses. Another thing to consider when it comes to data are those gatekeeper courses that you might have on your campus. When you sort of look at grade distributions and how people perform in a course, you start to see, if you were to look at course success and program success, et cetera, you would start to see that there are some courses that function as gatekeepers. I'm not here to argue whether or not gatekeepers are right or wrong, but potentially you have some accidental gatekeepers that are preventing people from moving to the next step, but not really providing value. If your end goal is to meet the student success objective of coming out of an institution with what they've needed to learn to do what they want to do or to be who they want to be, then the question is, what is the value of that gatekeeper course? And is it appropriate where it's situated, or maybe should it move somewhere else in the course sequencing? You hear there are lots of different ways that you can leverage data to improve and drive student success. University of Mary has really done a great job of understanding the importance of their data and how you can use it. Melissa is going to talk about the process of getting your data to work for you through good data governance. Back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Megan. All right. So I'm going to start with the very obvious. You can't do anything that Megan talked about on that prior slide without good data. And this is something that my own institution knows painfully well, as we've had to put in a massive amount of effort over the last several years to get our data governance practices up to a high enough standard that we could really start gathering meaningful analytics. So here's a quick history. We implemented Genzibur EX as our new student information system back in 1999-2000. Prior to that, we'd been using the world's most poorly designed access database to maintain student course and degree records. And as you can imagine, the institution did not have a strong IT program nor any real concept of data governance or best practice at the time of transition to Genzibur EX. This meant that despite Genzibur's best efforts to train the institution on how to use its shiny new SIS, people started misusing the system the second the training team left our campus. And over the next several years, each individual department did whatever it wanted in terms of practice. No one really talked to each other, meaning that the student accounts team would be entering one set of codes, and the registrar's office would come along, notice that the students looked weird, overwrite things to suit their preferences, and then student development would show up, and then they would do the same thing, and then the business office, and admissions, and advancement, and you get the picture. Additionally, certain departments would kind of randomly repurpose fields. An example of this is that the advancement team wanted somewhere to put spouse first names. And rather than using the relationships tool that existed in system to create a record for the spouse and tie it back to the original person, they decided it was just easier to repurpose the nickname field on the name master to be the place for spouse first names. You can imagine the chaos and confusion this created when one department thinks that the field is for, well, nicknames, and then another department is putting first names in there, yes, but ones that belong to somebody else. I'm not sure how many people received communications addressing them by the wrong name, but you can bet it happened. And compounding all of this, almost no one on campus knew how to write custom queries to pull data out, nor even how to edit existing queries. Over time, this led to a widespread belief that reports couldn't be written or changed, and so people became convinced that the only way to access their data easily was to create little shadow databases and keep it outside of the system entirely. So advancement might keep a list of donor addresses in a notebook in someone's desk. Admissions would have an Excel worksheet detailing student remediation requirements, saved locally on a secretary's computer. And financial aid would occasionally print a list of scholarship recipients, scan it, and then save it on a shared drive. And obviously, all of these little secret information hoards made any attempt at gathering analytics or even just basic information really hard. And hence my mantra over the years has become death to all shadow databases. So by the time I joined the university in fall of 2010, key members of university leadership had realized that something had to change. In 2011, we formed the Data Standards Committee, which is a cross-functional governance group made up of data owners from all corners of the university. I serve as the representative for all things academic, student records, and advising related. Other members represent from admissions, financial aid, student accounts, HR, payroll, accounts receivable, instructional technology, advancement, and of course our IT team. This group has taken on the task of approving, publishing, training, and enforcing data standards for all system usages. And the primary area of focus here, of course, is Bar 1, which is where we've moved to. It's our current ERP. But we also work on standards and governance for any system that integrates back into J1. About 3 years ago, after years of incremental improvements in our data governance practice and policy, we undertook a year-long data cleanup initiative wherein we standardized old problematic data from back in the bad old days. And since that time, we have been able to make really tremendous strides in building out our reporting services and analytics. So we've gone from a complete desert of information to having more dashboards and specialized reports than we can almost keep up with. The baseline for our reporting and analytics is our data warehouse. Our IT team had created the warehouse about 8 years ago, first in order to normalize and automate our iPads and other compliance reporting. And over the years, the warehouse has grown to become really the beating heart of a robust analytics effort. Bar 1 is, of course, the single source of truth in terms of our record-keeping practices, but at its core, J1 is a transactional database. The warehouse is able to capture snapshots at specific points in time and enables us to assess how our data change over time in a really meaningful way. So one example here, a major initiative over the last couple years was the development of the enrollment flows dashboard. And this dashboard enables end users to compare student enrollment patterns year over year, term by term, and student market by market. We can see how many students persist from one term to the next, how often they stop out, and if they return, at what rate they either graduate or exit without completing, how often they switch programs, and all of this is neatly able to be segmented into the student groups I talked about earlier. This means we are able to push our retention and success metrics far beyond the bog standard freshman to sophomore retention rate, and to really look at all of our student types and understand what retention and success means for each group. We can identify barriers and fall-off points by program and develop supports and interventions that align with our actual trends. And now we are going to go back to Megan to learn about collaborating to drive student success.
Great, thank you. one of the things that you hear really clearly when Melissa's speaking about what they've done at U of M, you understand quite clearly that this has been a campus-wide effort, and it has to be. Collaboration is really, really essential to be able to drive student success initiatives on your campus. Breaking down departmental silos is now more important than ever for institutions. You can personalize all you want, you can leverage all the data you want, but without coming together as a community, all of these efforts in student success, or maybe not all of them, a lot of them will fail. You'll have competing priorities and a lot of different problems that just could be circumvented. So it starts with culture. Get strategic and provide a cross-institutional definition of student success. This gets stakeholder buy-in. A few years ago, we at Genzabar got a group of about 20 institutions together, and we really wanted to just talk about student success, what that looked like on their institution, what they were pursuing, and so on and so forth. And one of the kickoff questions was, how does your campus define student success? And it was a little terrifying because there was like one of the 20 institutions that had actually bothered to define student success outside of retention. Besides the retention and graduation rates, they weren't really thinking about it. And that means that the goal that they're trying to hit is just this institutional rate, which doesn't really translate for what we're aiming to do for students. So as an institution, how do you define student success? What is your charter, rallying cry, brand, promise? What's your mission statement? This is really important to understand what you're going after. Also, because if you want to measure student success outside of these point-in-time measurements we have, persistence from term to term, retention, completion, what have you, if there are other things that you need to be measuring, particularly because of different student populations that don't fit into that kind of stereotypical way of talking about students, then you really need to find a way to measure that so that you can say whether or not your efforts are successful. Do you know your student population? Who are the cohorts? Tie this back with all the data and the analytics. It's important to be able to go down and understand the risk factors by those cohorts. There are so many assumptions about risk that really don't pan out. So how do you choose your probationary students? This is one of my favorite pet peeves to discuss with campuses, is that sometime at some point in time, they just said this GPA and this SAT or ACT means the student's on probation, or the bottom 25% of their class, or whatever they've done. But no one actually did the work to find out if that's really what's going to make a difference in seeing the students do better. Maybe use a risk model instead to identify who you should be pinpointing with that extra help and effort. Gaining alignment starts from the top down, and prioritizing which cohorts need the most help and where you can make the biggest impact, that's huge. So yeah, when we work with a traditional four-year school, we often do cohorts, first year, second year, et cetera. But we also work with schools that want to, target their trio students. Potentially they want to work with their athletes. There are a lot of different segments that you could potentially use. Melissa talked about some great ones. You don't need to just break it into all students. It's actually not as valuable. And that does bring us to knowing your students. So student satisfaction is in the experience. And collaboration for a seamless experience for the student is really important. They need to feel like from start to finish, you're engaged with them in a way that makes sense and makes them feel confident in their journey. So what kind of students do you have? What are their cohorts? Their needs and goals may differ greatly, just as we've heard. Melissa said, the adult students don't really care about your awesome campus life. That's maybe not their first priority to hear about. But they may care about feeling like they belong with the campus community. They still need some sense of connection, and how can you foster that? Our goal for students on the higher ed side is often keep them enrolled, full-time preferable, but their goals may be really different. So having conversations with students by their cohorts individually and understanding what their goals are, understand their desired outcomes, and then create a campus experience and a learning experience that really matches that And you will see your students be infinitely more successful because they will be able to identify the purpose of what they're doing and feel like it matches their goals. It's also really important to identify bottlenecks. So institutions do often have competing mandates. And I'm going to put a loaded question out here that might make some of you uncomfortable. Is it more important for the professor to have academic freedom, or is it more important for students to achieve their desired outcomes? This is an example of a competing mandate. We know that lecture is not generally a very effective way for students to learn. Yet telling professors that they need to stop lecturing because students don't learn that way, or they need to reformat their class or deliver it in another manner, that then kind of pokes into academic freedom. But at the same time, we've got this priority of student outcomes. How do you solve those? How do you prioritize? That's for your campus to discover. There are also processes that are unintentionally difficult for students, like that bill pay example. Another institution we've worked with has found out that too much grace actually backfires. So they were always extending grace. They were always expanding deadlines. They were always letting things go. And what they found out is not only was that bad for the institution because they weren't, getting the money from the students that they needed, but on top of that, it was also bad for the students. They were not achieving the end goal. There's such a thing as potentially too much grace, and that's not positive for either party. Transparency, lastly, is so important for students and for the campus community. Tell them what you're aiming for clearly. Tell your campus community that seeing students successful is really, really important. And no, that doesn't mean things like my favorite example when I launched Attention Software, when I used to work directly in higher education, was being told that I was asking them for grade inflation. That was not the message I was trying to get. That was the message that was received, unfortunately. So talking about why student success is important and what it does and what it is not is really important. And also showing students how much we really are pursuing that success for them and how that is our most important point. Now I'm going to hand it back to Melissa, and she's going to talk a little bit more about what they've been doing at U of M.
Thanks, Megan. Yep. Okay, so like most universities, UMary has a committee or a working group for just about everything. If we need to make a decision about what color to paint a wall, you had better believe that we have a committee for that. And while the efficacy of some of these groups is suspect, collaborative working groups do remain the key to success, especially when it comes to supporting our students. One group that has been tremendously important to enhancing our student success strategies is our retention committee, which, despite its name, has a far broader scope than simple freshman to sophomore retention. This is a cross-functional group made up of representatives from academic affairs, faculty and administration from each of our academic schools, and professional staff from the Student Success Center, enrollment management, financial aid, athletics, and student affairs. I have served on this group for about 7 years now, both in my prior life working in enrollment management and in my current role as university registrar. The cross-functional nature of this group ensures that student success is being defined broadly, and efforts to support success are formed holistically from all angles of the student college experience. And in order to support and drive university-wide understanding of student success, the Retention Committee supported and provided leadership in 2 major technology initiatives recently. First was the development of the enrollment flows dashboard I mentioned earlier. The committee relies on this dashboard in order to identify trends and patterns among our student enrollments, and then leverages those data in developing strategic responses. Second, the university purchased and implemented Genzibar Retention 3 years ago, which is an early alert system that is now used by faculty and staff across the institution for all student types. And retention has been a game changer in terms of being able to both view the student across multiple vectors and also give us a really easy tool for communication between the entire success team for an individual student. Using retention, a classroom instructor might submit an alert that a student's attendance has suddenly started slipping. Elsewhere, an RD may log that the same student has been having interpersonal conflicts with their suite mates lately. And then over in the financial aid office, a counselor there might note that the same student has just reported that a parent had lost their job, and that their family was facing a financial crisis as a result. And suddenly we have a complete picture of something that we can act on. The early alert admin will see all of these alerts for the same student and, one, share the appropriate information about all of these issues with the correct staff, and two, will assign specific interventions to suit the situation. In this case, they may ask an advisor to call that student in for a conversation and possibly even connect the student to our counseling services if it becomes evident that the student's attendance and relationships are being affected by the stress from their family situation. And without this window into the student's interactions with all of these departments, it may never become apparent that the student was even in need of an intervention. A different example of ways in which we have collaborated to drive success is the redevelopment of our first year experience course last year. The retention committee had observed a trend of higher attrition rates for students enrolled in particular sections of our FYE course. The sections in question were those earmarked for incoming students interested in the health sciences and who had actually been high academic achievers at the high school level. A task force was formed consisting of myself, one of our deans, the director of the Student Success Center, director of Residence Life, and the NCAA compliance officer. And I'll admit, we may seem like an odd group, but we had enthusiasm and we also had data. So that was good. After reviewing the literature and examining our existing practices, this group proposed a revamp to FYE that would ensure that all of our new freshmen would take the same FYE course, as we felt that the version that was being offered to our incoming high performers was missing critical elements, and that was due to an incorrect assumption about the level of preparedness students would have coming into college just because they had stronger high school GPAs. While the new curriculum requires that all sections teach specific foundational concepts and skills, we did also retain the best parts of our old system, enabling our higher performing students to be taught by regular faculty in the field the student is interested in, connecting those students directly with faculty advisors instead of Student Success Center advisors, and grouping sections of students who are in similar majors together to enable them to form community early. And this fall was our first semester with the new format in place, but we are really happy with the solution that we came up with, and we think it's going to have a very positive impact on the long-term success of all of our new students. And now we will go back to Megan one more time to show us how technology can help bring all of this together.
Thanks, Melissa. Technology expands what we're able to do. There's so much more technology. In fact, even thinking from when I started on the software side about 8 years ago, and then to now, like for instance, what we're able to do with modeling and what more data we can get more easily, it's amazing what we're able to do. But because there's so much technology and there's so much data, it's sometimes very challenging to think through or think about or execute a strategy that really makes sense. Things that I recommend, I think, make a big difference are things like having a centralized platform that can deliver on these things like personalization, data analytics, and collaboration. So those disparate systems you have on your campus, like I said, some campuses have upwards of 70. Getting all that data to talk and getting everyone to talk all over the place on those things is really hard to do. You heard from Melissa that one of retention's really powerful impacts for her campus, that's the product retention to be clear, was that everyone could look in the same place and understand a more holistic picture of this information that's not easy to get anywhere else and work with that information as appropriate with appropriate permission. Now, a holistic view really fosters collaboration. It also is a single source of truth on the view of student success. Most also important, another consideration, not just centralized, not just holistic, but also easy to use. It's really important that staff can jump in without a ton of training, without needing to be like they're rocket scientists to be able to use it. And that's something that we're always very passionate about at Gensbar, is making sure that you could pick up and run with the software without a lot of extra work. It makes it easier to scale. And then we're also looking always for places for automation or to simplify tasks, make things go on in the back end to make the front end just super easy to use. I mean, think about things that we're able to do. For personalization, we've got the chatbot. itself, what's more personalized than when a student has a question, they can go ask it and get an immediate answer. That's better than any messaging you could ever push out because you cannot predict what question is going to happen when. Well, you could, probably with the right data, enough of it, but let them come to you and provide that information. Or think about MC, which is really powerful. It does that tie together for tying educational commitment. So what we're able to do is we're able to have the student take a survey and say, this is what I want to get out of my education. This is where I belong. And then help them draw the conclusion of what their education is getting them and why it's relevant and important. We've got a lot that we can do in terms of data analytics, whether it's from working with the retention suite and doing some student success modeling or working with analytics itself. I do see a question in there that we can address hopefully later. But we can function as basically a mini analytics department for institutions that are not huge and can't afford to have, a data scientist on staff or data engineers. Really, what's so important, though, about what we do with our GenSmart One products is how we bring them together so that they all collaborate and speak. And really to help us deliver on these goals of personalization, data and analytics, and then collaboration to see students successful. That's all we've got, and now I'm going to hand it back off so we can answer some of those questions that are popping up in the Q&A panel.
Perfect. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time today. Like you just mentioned, we do have some time for a Q&A where Melissa, Melanie, and Megan can answer any questions that you may have. For those of you who have not yet submitted a question, I know we have a few that came in already, but please do so now by submitting it in the Q&A panel, which should be located below the chat panel at the bottom of your screen. Also, really quick, there are a good amount of you here today, so if you would like to ask questions, of other attendees that are here, chat back and forth, please feel free to communicate in the main chat as well. But let's get right on to those questions. So let's see, one of our participants asked about how they can apply the 3 rules that were shared on the slide about leveraging data to drive student success. So that includes, predictive modeling, intervention plans, removal of functional barriers. Megan, do you want to answer that since you led that particular slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So LMS data is sort of like my favorite thing. It's the gold mine because there's a ton of engagement data. And so if you give us, or if you yourself are able to access that data, you know a lot about your students. And what's really fascinating would be able to feed all that information of, are they participating in discussion? What are their login behaviors like? How much time do they spend on assignments, et cetera? And actually use that to create a predictive model. And then so intervention-wise, LMS is another great place to look at that, because what if they have not turned in assignments? These can be automatic alerts that you can set up, potentially with different rules or guidelines. And then lastly, removal of barriers. So one of the cool things that we're going to be working on hopefully in 2021 is not just having the chatbot work necessarily for our LMS, but for others as well. So let's say there's a functional barrier in how the LMS is maybe difficult for students, or to be honest, faculty to navigate. You could provide that Q&A type functionality to help them get answers to, how to use and remove that functional barrier. So how do I submit my assignment? Well, here's how. Or how do I do grading? Actually, a lot of times professors do struggle with LMSs. So how can you make that easier for them? And that would be huge, for sure.
Definitely, I agree with you there, 100%. So this next question is for you, Melissa. So you mentioned a few times the first year experience course at the University of Mary, and one of our attendees was wondering how many staff members are involved in advising students during this course.
Sure, thanks, Stephen. So our Student Success Center, everyone employed in that center teaches at least one section of FYE. Some of them teach several. And our center it's kind of split into two distinct advising groups. On the one, we have our regular student success advisors who deal with kind of our at-risk students who come in that first semester, and then they also support at-risk students throughout their entire academic career, especially students who are on warning. And they serve as a walk-in advising service for any student who just doesn't want to go to their regular advisor. So they have a lot of hats. So that team consists of the director of the Student Success Center, and then she has 3 advisors underneath her. So that's a group of 4. And then the other half of that department is our TRIO advising team. We do have a Title III TRIO program here on campus, and they serve students who are either disabled, economically disadvantaged, the standard criteria for TRIO, and they will serve their assigned students in their program throughout that student's entire career. So we also, in addition to all the other segments I mentioned, we've also got TRIO sections of FYE that are unique sections just for our TRIO students to kind of be able to form community together and be taught directly by one of those TRIO advisors. So they take all of the incoming students who are a little bit more at risk. That group also teaches our transfer seminar for all of our first semester transfer students. So there's 8 of them, and then we've got regular teaching faculty who teach, as I mentioned, we've kind of got that FYE course segmented by risk level for incoming students. So our students that come in at without, in green status basically, they'll go straight into those other FYE sections, and they're taught by faculty in their field. So we have a total of 22 freshman sections this semester for FYE.
Perfect. Thanks. This next question is actually for you again, Melissa. So when you were talking about collaboration at the University of Mary, one of our attendees was asking, what software you use to create and publish your dashboards. Now, I think Megan answered this question on her next slide, but if you'd like to just jump in quickly and mention what that software is, that'd be great.
Sure. We've got mixed methods going on here at the University of Mary. We've got lots of tools. Of course, our core database is GenSpar 1, but our report writing tool is we use SSRS for some reports, and we've also, our dashboards themselves, we've been creating using Power BI, which is part of the Office 365 package with expanded purchases, of course. The Power BI has been a really, really powerful tool, and we've got just a fantastically talented report writer that we've been fortunate enough to add to our team over about the last year and a half, and he's made our lives so much better. I cannot speak highly enough of Jim Sorensen. He's listening. He deserves double his salary and possibly a dozen red roses. He's wonderful.
Thank you very much. So before I ask any more questions, I just want to let everyone know there's still time for our presenters to answer any questions you might have. So feel free to send any more questions in the Q&A panel for us to get to. And if for whatever reason, if we run out of time and we don't get to your question, the GenSpar team will most likely get back to you after the presentation. So this next question, our attendee was asking, how do they do big data analytics at small institutions where their cohorts and their groups are smaller?
I can take that, although Melissa may have pointers as well. So, there are challenges, like doing a predictive model with a smaller data set with a small cohort means that you need more years of data. That for sure is a challenge. One of the things, though, that I always like to hammer home and that my data scientists definitely want me to say as much as possible is that sometimes you don't need big data. Sometimes what you really need to do is you need to ask yourself, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? and then say, okay, how do we solve that problem? And do we have the data to solve that problem? Because it could be a predictive model is what you need, and then we go about solving it. Or it could be you need a correlational analysis. You need something a little less sophisticated. So, there's this idea of analytics maturity where you go all the way from just descriptive to diagnostic, all the way up to nudges, and that's great. But the most important thing is that you're using the data that you have and collecting good data, right? But using it in a way that actually solves a business problem, not for the sake of doing big data for big data. I mean, big data is awesome, don't get me wrong, but solutions are the most important thing.
Perfect. Melissa, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I think everything Megan said is right. I think also for us, I consider we're technically a small institution, although with 3,800 students, I recognize there are even smaller institutions out there. But for us, the data is significant to you, even if it's, maybe not as significant as you would like it to be just from a scale perspective when you're starting to play with models and whatnot. But for us, everything we collect can be used to answer a question. So we've not had a lot of concerns or inability to make sense of our groups, because if we know who those groups are, they've existed over time, we've collected information about them, and you just kind of scale your analytics to the size of that group. So I think Megan gave a much better answer than that, but like for us, our incoming freshman group, we've had some variety the last few years, but our average tends to be about 440 new freshmen in the fall. And that group has been, for us it's a big group, but I think for a lot of schools it sounds very small, but they have been very easy to, parse and make sense out of those groups. And we have actually gone through the predictive modeling process with Genzibar. We did purchase a freshman predictive model from them when we went live with retention a few years ago. So we do model our incoming freshman class. We're able to see what our biggest risk factors are and clump those together. As expected, they tend to be about academics and they tend to be about money. So it may not be that anything's particularly earth-shattering, but now that we know that, it's all about strategizing for how do we meet those needs of our students, even though we've only got 400 and some to worry about in that particular group.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have time for one last question. And again, Melissa, this is a question for you. How do you know where to start when it comes to segmenting your student populations?
Yeah, so for us, it always, kind of like Megan mentioned in her earlier answer, it depends on the problem you're trying to solve, right? So first off, we know some groups have to be groups. We know our freshmen got to be grouped as freshmen and our transfers are transfers because we've got to be able to write policy that surrounds them. And that's often been a big indicator to me, is if a student pops up on my radar as registrar and the queen of policy, and suddenly I discover that I have a policy that doesn't fit the student, that's often an indication that, oh, we forgot somebody. This group is being left out in our current policies. How are they being left out in our programs? What are we forgetting? So that's one good starting point for me, is whenever I find somebody that doesn't fit, and then I think, oh gosh, how many of these are there? Is this a one-off? Is this a big deal? So that's one starting place for me, is just, we had a problem. Why did we have a problem? How do we fix it? And another place is starting with your data and just starting to parse through, are we getting big fall-off points where we've got big groups of students that are leaving a program? Does this program specifically have a retention problem? And those students are, not only leaving that program, but they're leaving the whole institution. What's happening there? Are we having a bunch of students who are exiting the university, and we give a fairly detailed survey to all of those students as part of the exit process? What are they telling us about why this wasn't working for them? How do we make sure that every program that we think about, is there a group out there that's going to be excluded from those programs? So those are all places where we start. It tends to happen a little bit grassroots as you just find a problem or a population that isn't being served, and then you really start to recognize that that is a distinct population, and targeting your programming and your policy around serving that particular group.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And again, so that concludes our web seminar today. Just want to say really quickly, thank you, Melanie, Megan, and Melissa, all of you, for your insights. We really appreciate your time here today, sharing your experience with us, and our audience appreciates it as well. And I would also like to thank our attendees for joining us today. For those who enjoyed our presentation, there are many more upcoming web seminars like this one that are provided by University Business, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, in addition to trends, as well as current event issues in higher education. Our wide range of readers at University Business, they subscribe for free and stay up to date with us through our print magazine, as well as the digital edition of the magazine, our e-newsletters such as UB Daily, and web seminars like this one. Also, for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or maybe those of you who believe that the solutions that were provided would be helpful to your colleagues, you'll be pleased to know that an archive recording of this web seminar, it will be available at the URL, which you can find on your screen right here. You can also expect to receive an email from our team here at University Business at some point tomorrow, which will include a link to all of the slides. And with that, I would just like to say thank you, everyone, for taking part in this web seminar today. This is Stephen Blackburn, and enjoy the rest of your year. Be safe and be well. Thank you very much.